In the heart of Maryland, in the early 19th century, there was a man whose life story would become both a beacon of hope and a stark reminder of the horrors of slavery. His name was Josiah Henson, and the truth of his life was buried in the shadow of the myth created by a world eager to forget the uncomfortable past. But the real story of Josiah Henson, who lived a life so extraordinary that it became the foundation for one of the most iconic characters in American literature, is one that has been largely ignored by history. The chilling truth about Henson's story lies in the way America has forgotten or distorted its past to justify its sins. While many know the fictionalized version of his life through the character of Uncle Tom from Harriet Beecher Stowe's famous novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, the real man behind the image was far more complex, far more courageous, and far more tragic. Josiah Henson's life was never meant to be a mere footnote in history, yet that is how it has often been treated. His story is a tragic reminder of how power, history, and identity are intertwined, and how deeply personal experiences can become buried beneath layers of myth and misrepresentation. Born into slavery on the Benjamin B. Ball plantation in Charles County, Maryland, Henson was one of the countless souls whose life was controlled by an institution designed to strip them of their humanity. Like so many others, he was born to a mother who had already known the horrors of slavery. His early years were spent in the unrelenting grasp of a brutal system that denied him freedom, education, and even his own identity. The world he was born into was not just one of physical chains, but of psychological oppression, where the very thought of independence was something forbidden and dangerous. Yet, from an early age, Henson exhibited qualities that set him apart from the other slaves on the plantation. There was something about him that made people take notice, something more than his physical strength or his ability to work the land. His intelligence and innate sense of leadership began to reveal themselves early on, even in the face of overwhelming oppression. By his teenage years, Josiah had already developed an awareness of the deep injustices around him. He was acutely aware of the suffering of those around him, and yet he seemed to sense that there was more to the world beyond the walls of the plantation. His ability to understand the power dynamics at play in the world of slavery made him a unique figure in a world where slaves were often denied their humanity. Josiah was not just a passive victim of the system, he was a man who began to see the cracks in the facade that held the institution of slavery together. These early glimpses into the horrors and contradictions of the world around him were what shaped his understanding of freedom and justice, ideas that would eventually lead him to defy the very institution that had enslaved him. The plantation owner, known for his cruelty, saw Josiah's strength and intelligence as both a blessing and a threat. While he allowed Josiah to serve as a driver, a kind of overseer among the enslaved, he was also increasingly wary of the man's potential for rebellion. Josiah's rise within the system was not because of any favor shown by his master, but because of his own abilities. However, his position as a trusted servant in the eyes of his owner came with its own set of moral dilemmas. To those around him, Josiah was the embodiment of the paradox that lay at the heart of slavery, a slave who showed leadership, yet was trapped in a system that sought to crush any form of leadership in the enslaved. Josiah's fate was a precarious one, balanced between the expectations of his masters and the deep, irrepressible pull of his own morality. While Henson's life on the plantation was marked by servitude, it was also marked by a growing awareness of the inherent cruelty of the system. His experiences exposed him to the extremes of both human kindness and inhumanity. His relationships with fellow slaves were shaped by the shared bond of suffering, but they were also tempered by the knowledge that survival in this world meant sacrificing parts of one's soul. As he matured, Josiah's own moral compass began to solidify. He understood that his survival, his ability to endure in such a brutal system, could not be achieved at the cost of losing his own humanity. But this realization also led to an even more terrifying realization: the system of slavery, which held him and so many others in its iron grip, was built not just on the power of physical force, but on the destruction of the spirit. It was this awareness that ultimately set Josiah apart. Unlike many of his fellow slaves, who learned to accept the brutality of their existence as inevitable, Josiah began to see his situation not just as a personal struggle, but as part of a larger system of oppression. His mind, keen and questioning, refused to accept the justification of slavery that permeated the culture of the South. He began to see the system of slavery not only as a moral evil but also as a system that thrived on deception. Slaveholders had built a society where both slaves and free people were taught to view slavery as an unquestionable reality, one that was ordained by God and protected by law. This deeply ingrained belief system served to protect slavery and to silence any dissent, no matter how powerful the voice that rose against it. The early years of Josiah's life were defined by the tension between survival and morality, between the cruelty of the system and the strength of his spirit. But even as he struggled to maintain his sense of self within the confines of slavery, there was another, more insidious force at play in his life, the idea that his story, and the stories of so many others like him, was being erased. Slavery was not just a physical institution, it was a cultural one, and the voices of the enslaved were routinely silenced, ignored, or distorted. Their stories, no matter how extraordinary, were buried beneath the weight of a history that refused to acknowledge their humanity. As Josiah's years on the plantation wore on, it became increasingly clear that he was not just a survivor of the system, he was becoming a symbol of the potential for resistance. The plantation system had tried to crush his spirit, but it had instead nurtured a man who would one day rise above the system that had imprisoned him. However, in the world of slavery, any form of rebellion was a dangerous thing, and those who dared to question the system found themselves caught in a battle that could cost them their lives. For Josiah, this battle would not only be one of survival, but one that would pit him against the very system that had shaped his life. He was not yet free, but his mind was already beginning to break free from the chains that sought to bind him. The foundation for Josiah Henson's eventual escape from slavery was being laid not only in the physical world but in his mind and heart. The struggle was both internal and external. But this internal shift, this transformation of his spirit, was not something that would happen overnight. It would take years of suffering, sacrifice, and ultimately, a decision that would change his life forever. His journey from slavery to freedom would not be a simple one. It would be a path fraught with danger, but it would also be a path that would lead him to a destiny that history would later seek to forget. Josiah Henson's early life is marked by a fundamental paradox. He was both a victim of slavery and a man destined to break free of its constraints. In a world where most enslaved individuals were reduced to mere property, Josiah's story would transcend the boundaries of slavery, and in doing so, it would ultimately become one of the most important and tragically forgotten stories in American history. The tension that defined his early years, between survival and resistance, between obedience and defiance, set the stage for the extraordinary life that would follow. Josiah Henson's early life was shaped by the world he was born into, a world where the rules of humanity were subverted, where one's very existence was determined by the color of their skin. The year was 1789 when he first opened his eyes to the brutality of slavery, a system that had been entrenched in the American South for centuries. His early experiences, though not extraordinary by their nature, were woven into the complex, oppressive fabric of a society that valued human lives as commodities. As a child, Josiah was no different from the countless others who were born into this institution, yet there was something about him that seemed destined to break the chains that bound him to a system of dehumanization. Josiah was born in the town of La Plata, a small community nestled within the sprawling tobacco plantations of Maryland. The land itself was both beautiful and cruel, offering fertile soil for the crops that fed the growing economy of the South, but beneath the fields of green lay the rot of exploitation and pain. His father, an African-born man, had been brought to America in the brutal transatlantic slave trade, and his mother, also enslaved, gave birth to Josiah under the shadow of a society built on the idea of racial hierarchy. Slaves like Josiah's family were the backbone of the South, working tirelessly from dawn until dusk, their bodies worn down by years of labor. From the start, Josiah's life was not his own. His childhood was marked by the awareness that he was considered property, a mere possession to be bought and sold. This was a reality that every enslaved person in the South faced, but Josiah's keen mind and natural leadership abilities would soon mark him as different from the others. While most children of enslaved families were forced to endure the hardships of growing up without any semblance of security, Josiah's early years were defined by the expectations and limitations imposed on him by the society around him. As a boy, he was not allowed to experience the joys of freedom that other children in the area might have known. His world was a controlled one, governed by the whims of his owners, who determined when he would work, eat, and rest. The system of slavery in Maryland was particularly insidious. While there were pockets of resistance throughout the South, many areas, including Maryland, maintained a relatively moderate stance on slavery, meaning that the brutality was more psychological than physical. This didn't lessen the toll on those who lived under its grip, but it did create a paradox. Slaves were not always subjected to constant physical violence. Instead, they were subjected to a more insidious form of control, one that ate away at their sense of identity, their dignity, and their very sense of self-worth. Children like Josiah were raised with the constant reminder that their place in the world was not as free individuals, but as property. The crushing weight of this reality hung over his childhood, making it impossible for him to ever truly experience innocence or freedom. But even in this environment of systematic dehumanization, Josiah's inherent qualities began to shine through. His intelligence became evident at an early age. Despite the complete lack of formal education available to enslaved children, Josiah had an innate curiosity and a hunger for knowledge. It was this thirst for learning that set him apart from his peers. He watched the world around him closely, absorbing everything he could, particularly the complex dynamics of the plantation world. He saw how the plantation owners wielded their power, and how the enslaved people were subjected not only to physical labor but also to an unspoken psychological warfare. He understood that it was not just the overseer's whip that kept the slaves in line, but the constant, omnipresent fear of punishment, and the notion that their very souls were controlled by an institution that denied them agency. In the eyes of his masters, Josiah's mind was both a blessing and a potential threat. At the time, many slave owners found it beneficial to train certain enslaved people in skilled labor, blacksmithing, carpentry, and other trades, in the belief that it would make them more valuable. However, there was a fine line between using someone's skills and empowering them to the point of rebellion. Josiah's intelligence was seen as something to be harnessed for the benefit of the plantation's wealth, but it was also viewed with suspicion. As he grew older, Josiah began to grasp the true implications of his situation. He had learned how to play the game, how to survive within the framework of the plantation economy, but he also realized that he was trapped in a system that had no place for his individuality, his humanity. By the time he reached his teenage years, Josiah had gained a reputation among the other slaves. He was not only known for his strength and his work ethic but also for his ability to lead. He was chosen to be one of the drivers, a position that placed him in charge of the other enslaved people on the plantation. On the surface, being a driver might have seemed like a privilege, but in reality, it was a position of tremendous moral and psychological strain. Josiah was not only responsible for overseeing the labor of others, but he was also forced to uphold the very system that had enslaved him. He had to maintain control over the other slaves, ensuring that they did not falter in their work and that they did not try to escape. In many ways, the driver was a slave in his own right, caught between the interests of the masters and the plight of his fellow slaves. As Josiah took on this role, the tension within him began to grow. He became increasingly aware of the moral dilemmas that he was facing. On the one hand, he was being asked to betray the very people he considered his brothers and sisters, the people who had shared his suffering. On the other hand, he was being pressured to conform to the demands of his masters, who saw him as little more than a tool to help keep the system running. It was a position that would eventually break many men, but Josiah's strength of character allowed him to survive it, at least for a time. While Josiah's position as a driver gave him a certain degree of power, it also isolated him. The other slaves began to view him with suspicion, seeing him as a collaborator, a man who had chosen to work with the system rather than against it. Josiah understood this isolation and struggled with it. His conscience was torn between loyalty to his fellow slaves and the survival instincts that told him to keep his position in order to avoid punishment. At the same time, the cruelty of the plantation system began to wear on him. As he matured, the realization grew in him that he could not simply continue to live this way. His internal conflict was not just about his role as a driver, it was about his larger role in a world that saw him as less than human. The turning point came when Josiah was sold to another plantation. The decision to sell him was a reflection of the callousness of the system that held him captive. He had outgrown his usefulness to his masters, and they saw him as expendable. This was the moment when Josiah realized that the plantation system had no place for men like him, men who questioned their situation, men who thought beyond the chains that held them. This moment of realization would become the catalyst for his eventual escape, but before that moment arrived, Josiah would endure the brutal consequences of his attempts to reclaim his life and his freedom. It was on this new plantation that Josiah would face one of the most challenging moments of his life, a moment that would force him to make the ultimate choice between submitting to the oppressive system or breaking free from it once and for all. The world of slavery had left its mark on him in ways that no one could fully understand, but it was also shaping him into something more than a mere survivor. He was becoming a man of purpose, a man who would one day play a pivotal role in the struggle for freedom. In the quiet spaces of Josiah Henson's life, as the days blurred into one another with the unrelenting rhythm of slavery, there emerged a growing sense of unrest. He had long understood the system that enslaved him, but it was during his later years on the plantations that his awareness began to take on new dimensions. He had seen firsthand the horrors of the system, the brutal whippings, the separations of families, the exploitation of human lives for profit, but there were also the subtler horrors that ate away at the core of his soul, the constant dehumanization, the psychological warfare, and the crushing weight of being treated as less than nothing. These were the quiet, invisible chains that bound him. Josiah's mind, sharp and inquisitive from an early age, began to absorb not just the physical conditions of the plantation, but the ideological ones as well. He began to realize that the system wasn't merely about physical control, it was about domination of the spirit. The system relied not only on the constant threat of violence but also on the belief that the enslaved were inherently inferior. The idea that they could never be more than property was woven so deeply into the fabric of society that it was accepted without question by many. But Josiah, despite being caught in its snare, began to see through the lie. The shift in his thinking was subtle but powerful. As he worked alongside his fellow slaves, he began to notice the variations in how they responded to their captivity. Some, like him, exhibited signs of resistance, small, quiet acts of rebellion or defiance against the system, though they were often unnoticed or unrecognized by the masters. Others, however, had surrendered themselves completely to the system, retreating into the numbness of survival. Josiah couldn't help but wonder how such surrender came to pass. What was it that made some people cling to the hope of freedom, while others seemed content to accept their chains, even if only in their minds? The psychological toll of slavery was immense, but Josiah also knew that hope, when it was planted deep enough, could serve as a lifeline. For the first time, Josiah began to see the larger struggle, one that was not just about physical freedom, but about the very nature of the enslaved people's souls. He began to recognize that the plantation owners and those in power were not just controlling the bodies of the slaves, they were controlling their sense of self-worth, their very conception of their own identity. To strip a person of their identity, to convince them that they were less than human, was the cruelest form of oppression. It was in the midst of these realizations that Josiah began to embrace a sense of leadership, though not in the way he had before. No longer was he simply working to survive or to fulfill the expectations placed upon him. He began to see that he had a role to play beyond the plantation, one that would transcend the borders of his current life. He began to take note of the conversations that occurred among the other slaves when they thought no one was listening, the whispers of hope, of rebellion, of escape. He heard talk of the Underground Railroad, a secret network of abolitionists and sympathetic individuals working to help enslaved people escape to freedom in the North or Canada. These whispers stirred something deep within him, something that had been dormant but was now awake with urgency. The more he heard, the more he came to understand that there was a way out, though it was not a simple or safe path. The Underground Railroad was fraught with danger, and those who attempted to escape risked their lives and the lives of their loved ones. Yet, the mere possibility of escape ignited a fire within him, a fire that had been smoldering for years. He began to see the possibility of a life beyond the confines of slavery. He realized that his intelligence, his leadership, his understanding of the system could be his greatest assets in navigating this perilous journey. But as his awareness of the world beyond the plantation grew, so did his sense of isolation. The more Josiah began to entertain the idea of freedom, the more he felt detached from the people around him. His position as a driver, the one responsible for overseeing the labor of his fellow slaves, had already distanced him from many of them. Now, with his thoughts increasingly focused on escape and resistance, he found himself caught between two worlds, the world of the oppressed, and the world of those who held the keys to his potential freedom. He could no longer turn a blind eye to the sufferings of the other slaves, nor could he continue to ignore the moral conflicts that raged within him. The question that had haunted him for years, how to reconcile his own survival with his loyalty to his fellow slaves, had grown more urgent. Could he truly escape without abandoning those who remained behind? How could he lead others to freedom when he was still bound by the chains of his own existence? Josiah began to realize that his journey toward freedom wasn't just about escaping the physical bonds of slavery, it was also about navigating the complexities of his own conscience. The more he thought about it, the more he understood that the escape he sought had to be more than just an act of personal survival. It had to be a statement, a refusal to accept the system of slavery as the natural order of things. But even as he made this realization, a part of him feared the consequences of action. The slave system was built on control and fear, and those who resisted were often punished in brutal, public ways. It was not uncommon for those who tried to escape to be caught, tortured, and even killed as an example to others. Still, Josiah could not ignore the fire that burned inside him. He began to seek out others who shared his desire for freedom, seeking to learn from those who had successfully escaped or were actively involved in the abolitionist movement. Through these clandestine meetings, he began to build a network of trusted individuals, some enslaved, some free, who shared his goal of undermining the institution of slavery. These individuals became his source of strength and encouragement, their shared experiences and aspirations for freedom knitting them together in a bond stronger than the chains that bound them. But the path forward was far from easy. As Josiah's awareness of his own potential for resistance grew, so did the awareness of his masters. His position as a driver, while offering him some measure of autonomy, also made him a target. He was a visible figure among the enslaved, and any hint of rebellion on his part would not go unnoticed. Josiah began to feel the weight of the eyes that watched him, both from his fellow slaves and from his masters. He was now caught in a web of tension and suspicion, with no clear way out. Every word he spoke, every action he took, was scrutinized for signs of rebellion. In the quiet moments, as he lay in his small, sparse quarters at night, Josiah wondered if escape was even possible. The journey was dangerous, the risks were high, and the consequences of failure were unimaginable. Yet the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he could not continue living this way. He could not remain in a system that dehumanized him and those he loved. The seed of freedom had been planted within him, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, it had begun to take root in his soul. It was at this point that Josiah made the most difficult decision of his life. He would attempt to escape, not just for his own sake, but for the sake of all those who remained trapped within the walls of slavery. He understood the risks, he knew the dangers, but he also understood that the alternative was to live a life that was not truly his own. He had been enslaved in body for too long, now, he would free his spirit. The journey ahead would be fraught with peril, but Josiah was determined to take the first step, no matter where it would lead him. As Josiah Henson began to contemplate the possibility of escape, the weight of the decision hung heavily on him. Every choice, every action, would be fraught with danger. The consequences of failure were unforgiving. It wasn't just his life at risk, but also the lives of his family and fellow slaves who might be implicated in his flight for freedom. Yet, despite the fear and uncertainty that gripped him, there was something in the depth of his soul that could no longer be silenced. The brutality of the plantation system had chipped away at his sense of self for far too long. The whispers of hope he had heard from others, the tales of those who had made it to freedom, had awakened something inside him, a flame that could not be extinguished. He could no longer remain a passive participant in a system that sought to strip him of his dignity and his humanity. At first, the notion of escape seemed almost impossible. The plantation system was not designed to allow for escape, it was built on surveillance, fear, and repression. Enslaved people who tried to flee were often caught and brought back, only to face severe punishment or even death. The odds were stacked against him. But Josiah knew he could not remain a spectator in his own life. His own moral compass, the awareness he had cultivated over the years, now demanded action. He could no longer ignore the call of freedom that echoed in his mind, nor could he continue to abide by a life that was defined by the whims of his masters. In the days that followed, Josiah began to plan in secret. He had to be meticulous, careful, and resourceful. He knew that any mistake, any misstep, could result in failure, and in failure, there would be no second chance. He had seen what happened to those who were caught attempting to escape. The punishments were severe, whippings, branding, or worse. The fear of capture was not just a physical one, it was psychological as well. The plantation owners relied on the terror that such brutal retribution instilled in their slaves, and they used this fear to maintain control. The idea of escape, though seductive and powerful, was also fraught with an overwhelming sense of peril. The network of abolitionists and sympathizers who had once seemed so distant now began to take on greater importance in his mind. These people, some free, some still enslaved, formed the crucial web of resistance that Josiah would need to navigate if he was to have any hope of making it to freedom. It was through whispered conversations, secret meetings, and coded messages that Josiah began to make connections with those who could help him. The Underground Railroad, a loosely organized network of safe houses and individuals committed to aiding runaway slaves, became his lifeline. Still, there was a profound sense of isolation that accompanied his newfound determination. Josiah was not alone in his longing for freedom, but he was acutely aware that the path he was preparing to take was a solitary one. While there were others who shared his desire for escape, few would be able to accompany him on the perilous journey ahead. His family, his wife and children, remained behind, and he knew that in leaving them, he risked never seeing them again. The choice was agonizing. On the one hand, he knew that if he stayed, he would continue to endure the torment of a life defined by oppression. On the other hand, to leave them behind was a wrenching decision, one that could leave him forever haunted by the separation. Yet, as he continued to plan, the gravity of the situation began to solidify in his mind. His decision to escape was not just about survival, it was about defiance. It was about showing that the institution of slavery, no matter how entrenched, could be challenged. By risking everything to escape, he would not just be freeing himself, but also sending a message to the very heart of the system that had oppressed him for so long. Every step he took, every action he made, would be an act of resistance against the forces that sought to diminish his humanity. Josiah began to scout for an opportunity. He knew he would have to leave at night, under the cover of darkness, when the eyes of the plantation were least watchful. Every moment would count, and he could not afford any mistakes. He had learned to be resourceful during his years on the plantation. He knew how to blend into his surroundings, how to read the rhythms of the land, and how to use the landscape to his advantage. In his years as a driver, he had learned the fine art of observation, of watching for subtle signs that could signal danger or opportunity. These skills, honed over years of survival, would now serve him in his quest for freedom. It was during one of the many sleepless nights spent planning that Josiah overheard a conversation that would prove pivotal to his escape. He had been walking the grounds when he heard voices coming from the barn. At first, he thought nothing of it, there were always hushed conversations among the enslaved when the overseers were not around. But as he moved closer, he recognized the voices of two of his fellow slaves, speaking in low, urgent tones. The topic of their conversation made his heart race. They were talking about the escape routes north, about the abolitionists who would help them cross state lines and guide them toward freedom. Josiah's mind raced as he listened to the details of their plan. The route was dangerous, but it was not impossible. He knew that these paths, these hidden routes, were often treacherous, but they could also lead to safety. As the conversation drew to a close, Josiah made up his mind. He would not wait any longer. He would leave. He had to act. The next few days were filled with a nervous energy, as Josiah quietly gathered the small supplies he would need for his journey. He had learned to be discreet, to act without drawing attention. Food, water, a blanket, and a few personal belongings, small things, but vital to his survival once he was on the road. There was no way of knowing how long it would take to reach freedom, or how many dangers he would face along the way, but one thing was certain: Josiah could not remain on the plantation any longer. He had become a man determined to claim his humanity, to fight for a life beyond the confines of slavery. The night of his escape arrived. Josiah's heart beat loudly in his chest, but he moved with a quiet determination. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground, but he knew that the darkness would offer him the cover he needed. Every step was a risk, but every step was a step toward freedom. As he slipped away from the plantation, the weight of his decision settled in. He was leaving behind everything he had ever known, the land, the people, the life that had been dictated to him since birth. But in that moment, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the road ahead. The road to freedom. With every passing hour, the world he had known seemed to recede further behind him. The path he walked was fraught with danger, but it was also the only path that offered him hope. The Underground Railroad, with all its hidden networks and secret routes, was his only chance. Josiah would have to trust in the kindness of strangers and the promises of those who had helped others before him. But even as he moved forward, he knew that the real challenge had only just begun. The journey that Josiah Henson embarked upon in search of freedom was not one defined solely by the miles he had to traverse or the dangers that lurked at every turn. It was a journey that cut deep into his soul, challenging him to reckon with his own sense of identity, purpose, and survival. The night he slipped away from the plantation, leaving behind the life he had known for so long, was only the beginning of an odyssey that would test his physical endurance, emotional resilience, and unyielding desire to break free from the chains that bound him. As Josiah moved farther from the plantation, each step felt like both an act of liberation and an admission of the gravity of what he was attempting to do. In the dark, his footsteps were muffled by the earth, but the weight of the decision he had made pressed on him with the same heaviness as the shackles he had once worn. With each passing hour, the risks of discovery mounted. The landscape around him was unfamiliar, the sounds of night alien to his ears. The quiet rustling of leaves, the occasional creak of tree branches swaying in the wind, every noise became a potential threat. Yet, the sense of urgency that propelled him forward was also a driving force, keeping him moving despite the terror that constantly threatened to overwhelm him. Josiah knew that he could not afford to falter. The dangers of his escape were many. The paths he would have to take were not well marked, and there was always the possibility that his absence would be discovered, triggering a search. The plantation owners had resources at their disposal that would make tracking him down relatively easy if they were aware of his flight. But Josiah also understood that the further he traveled, the greater the chances that he would encounter allies, people who were willing to help him, who shared his desire to see the institution of slavery dismantled and replaced by a society built on justice and equality. It was not long before Josiah's fears became a reality. As he navigated through forests and crossed fields under the cover of darkness, he realized that he could not rely solely on the knowledge he had gained through his own observations. The landscape was vast, and the roads he had chosen were treacherous. He had heard whispers of the Underground Railroad, of abolitionists who hid fugitives in their homes and sent them along hidden routes toward freedom, but now, in the thick of the journey, Josiah felt a gnawing sense of uncertainty. Would anyone take him in? Could he truly trust those he encountered? The first significant obstacle came early in his flight. As he crossed a stretch of farmland, he was nearly caught by a pair of patrolling guards who were sent out to look for runaway slaves. The guards moved methodically, their lanterns casting shadows across the ground, their voices low but insistent. Josiah's heart raced as he crouched in the underbrush, praying that they would not hear the frantic beating of his heart. He pressed himself into the mud, his body stiff and trembling with fear. He had been prepared for danger, but now, with the sharp sounds of the guards drawing closer, the weight of the risks hit him harder than ever before. This was no longer a theoretical escape, this was life or death. The guards passed by without spotting him, their voices fading into the distance, but the near encounter left Josiah shaken. He had come so close to capture that the mere thought of returning to the plantation, of being caught and subjected to the brutal punishment that would surely await him, became almost unbearable. In that moment, Josiah made a silent vow to himself: he would not allow fear to govern him. He would continue, no matter the cost, because freedom was the only thing worth fighting for. After that close call, Josiah became even more cautious. He moved through the night, relying on the stars to guide him, but never straying too far from cover. Every shadow, every rustle in the trees, every flicker of light in the distance, became a potential danger. The constant tension left him on edge, every moment filled with a sense of impending doom. Yet, despite the overwhelming fear, there was a flicker of something else, a sense of determination that began to grow within him. The fear that once threatened to paralyze him now fueled his determination. He had already come so far, and he was unwilling to let the dangers of the journey stop him now. As he traveled through unfamiliar terrain, Josiah's thoughts turned to his family. His wife, Harriet, and his children remained behind on the plantation, their fates uncertain. The agony of leaving them was a constant ache in his chest, but he knew that his escape was not just for him, it was for them, too. Every step he took was a step toward the possibility of a future where they could be free. The thought of reuniting with them, of seeing them live a life free from the oppressive system of slavery, kept him moving forward. Yet, at the same time, the reality of his separation from them cast a shadow over his every move. The fear that he might never see them again was an unbearable thought, but it was one that he had to push aside in order to survive. After several days of travel, Josiah found a brief moment of respite. He came across a small cabin hidden in the woods, its smoke rising from the chimney, a sign of life. He hesitated at first, unsure of whether he should approach. The last thing he needed was to stumble into the home of someone who might betray him to the authorities. But his exhaustion, both physical and mental, pushed him to take the risk. He knocked softly on the door, and after a tense moment, a voice called out from inside. An older man opened the door, his weathered face lined with age and experience. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked Josiah over, but there was no sign of suspicion in his gaze. The man, after a long moment of silence, stepped aside and gestured for Josiah to enter. "You look like a man in need of help," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "Come in, before you freeze." Josiah entered, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea who this man was or whether he could be trusted, but the warmth of the cabin and the kindness in the man's voice were enough to make him feel safe, at least for the time being. The man, whose name Josiah later learned was Solomon, offered him food and water. They spoke in hushed tones, the weight of their conversation heavy with the knowledge of the risks involved. Solomon had once been a slave himself, and he had escaped to the north years earlier. He had since joined the abolitionist cause, helping those like Josiah who sought freedom. Solomon didn't ask many questions, understanding that the journey toward freedom was often one filled with uncertainty and fear. Instead, he provided Josiah with a place to rest and a brief respite from the journey. The next morning, after a quiet breakfast, Solomon provided him with a map of the route north and pointed him toward the next safe house. "The road ahead is long," Solomon said, "but if you keep moving, you'll find the freedom you seek. Trust in the people who help you, and never look back." As Josiah left Solomon's cabin, he felt a renewed sense of hope. The encounter had reminded him that he was not alone, that there were others who had walked this path before him and who were willing to help him along the way. He knew the journey ahead would be fraught with more dangers, but he also knew that it was a journey he could no longer turn back from. The promise of freedom, of life beyond the oppressive system of slavery, was within reach, and Josiah was determined to seize it with both hands. Every step, every decision, every risk he took now was one step closer to the life he had dreamed of, a life where he could finally claim his freedom, his dignity, and his humanity. As Josiah continued his journey, the hope that had initially fueled his escape began to be tempered by the cold realities of his situation. The further he traveled, the more he came to understand the depths of the perilous road he was on. While he had found brief refuge in the small cabin provided by Solomon, the safety it offered was fleeting. The time came when he had to leave the sanctuary behind, continuing his path toward freedom, knowing full well that the greatest danger still lay ahead. The terrain through which he traveled was harsh. The dense forests and rolling hills presented obstacles that he had not anticipated. Days blurred into nights, the sky above growing colder, and Josiah's body began to show the strain of the journey. His clothes, once sturdy, were now torn and ragged. The shoes that had carried him for miles were beginning to wear thin, and his body, though used to the hardships of slavery, began to ache from the continuous strain of travel. Yet, despite the discomfort, there was something in the grit of his bones, something that pushed him to keep moving forward, no matter how weary he felt. The vision of freedom, the hope that had sustained him through the darkest hours of his life, was still there, a distant, flickering light in the vast expanse of uncertainty. But Josiah's journey was not merely a physical one, it was a psychological odyssey as well. He had left behind the only life he had ever known, the only community he had ever been part of, and now, he was alone in the world. Though he had found solace in the kindness of strangers like Solomon, the truth was that every step he took further removed him from the life he had once been forced to endure. There was an overwhelming sense of loneliness that seemed to settle in his chest like a heavy stone. The pain of separation from his family, the wife and children he had left behind, was a constant ache that never faded. Every night, as he lay in the unfamiliar darkness of the wilderness, he could not help but wonder whether he would ever see them again. The possibility that his escape could lead to a future without them gnawed at his heart. The loneliness was compounded by the ever-present danger that stalked him. Even as he put miles between himself and the plantation, Josiah knew that there were eyes everywhere. The southern states were vast, and although he had made it this far, the journey was far from over. He had learned that the Underground Railroad, though a lifeline, was not a perfect system. It was a series of hidden routes and safe houses, but the risk of betrayal was ever present. Abolitionists and sympathetic individuals could be trusted, but only as far as the reliability of the networks they were part of. The southern states were crawling with bounty hunters and vigilantes who made it their life's work to track down runaway slaves and return them to their masters. The further Josiah moved, the closer he came to the boundaries of those who would help him, and the more he understood that his survival depended on remaining hidden, on staying one step ahead of those who hunted him. It was in the midst of this growing uncertainty that Josiah encountered a new set of trials. His initial optimism, fueled by the hope of freedom, began to wane, replaced by the realization that the road to liberty was a treacherous one. The journey was not just about the distance between the plantation and the north, but about the internal conflict that seemed to grow with every passing mile. The man he had been, the obedient slave who worked tirelessly without question, was no more. In his place was a man who had been shaped by his suffering, his intelligence, and his unyielding desire to survive. Yet, even as he moved toward a future he had only dreamed of, Josiah was forced to confront the truth that he was becoming someone different, a man who had seen the darkest aspects of humanity, who had borne witness to cruelty and violence, and who had now chosen to take control of his fate. In doing so, he could never return to the person he had been. The further Josiah traveled, the more he encountered individuals who had also embraced the cause of abolition. Some were former slaves, like Solomon, who had escaped and now helped others find freedom. Others were free men and women who had put themselves in harm's way to aid the downtrodden. These people became his allies, though he knew he could never truly trust them completely. The very nature of his escape demanded secrecy, and even those who seemed sympathetic were often forced to act in the shadows, always fearing exposure. Josiah's encounters with these individuals were filled with both hope and skepticism. He had no way of knowing whether they would lead him toward safety or betrayal. One such encounter occurred when Josiah reached a town on the outskirts of Pennsylvania, a place known for its abolitionist activity. He had heard rumors of a station on the Underground Railroad located within the town, a place where runaways could find shelter and guidance. With little more than a vague description and a sense of instinct, Josiah made his way into the town, staying off the main roads and avoiding the bustling streets. The tension in the air was palpable as he moved, the fear of being discovered a constant weight on his shoulders. Every time someone glanced his way, he felt the heavy presence of suspicion. He had to remind himself that he was no longer a slave in the traditional sense, he was now a man on the run, and his very existence was a crime in the eyes of those who upheld the laws of slavery. It was in the small, dimly lit backroom of a local tavern that Josiah met an abolitionist named Rebecca. She was a woman in her 30s, her face worn with the fatigue of constant vigilance, her eyes sharp and calculating. Rebecca had been active in the Underground Railroad for years, and Josiah quickly realized that she was not someone to be taken lightly. She had seen the horrors of slavery firsthand, and her dedication to the cause was both resolute and dangerous. It was through her that Josiah learned of the next leg of his journey, the network that would guide him further north, closer to the promise of freedom. Rebecca gave Josiah a map, marking the locations of safe houses and routes that had been established by the Underground Railroad. She warned him that the journey would not get easier. There would be times when he would have to rely solely on his wits and instinct, times when he would need to disappear into the night with no trace of his presence. She spoke of bounty hunters, of the ever-present threat of being discovered, of the moral cost of helping fugitive slaves. And yet, despite the peril, Josiah could sense the strength in her voice, the fire that burned within her. She was not afraid, and in her stead, he found a new sense of resolve. Rebecca's words carried him through the next phase of his journey. With the map she had provided, Josiah now had a clearer sense of direction. But even with this newfound guidance, the dangers of his escape continued to weigh heavily on him. Every night, as he lay in hiding, he could not escape the constant awareness that his freedom was precarious, that every step he took brought him closer to safety, but also closer to discovery. The night would always come, and with it, the terrifying uncertainty of whether he would make it to the next station or be caught in the hands of those who would drag him back into bondage. Still, with every passing day, Josiah moved closer to his goal. The escape was more than just a physical journey, it was a test of his spirit, a journey that had transformed him from a man who had been broken by the system of slavery into one who would fight for the right to live as a free man. And though he knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, Josiah was no longer the man he had once been. He had stepped into a new identity, a man of purpose, a man of resistance, and nothing would stop him now. As Josiah ventured further north, the landscape around him began to shift in ways that mirrored the transformation happening within him. The heavy air of the southern plantations, thick with the weight of history and oppression, gradually gave way to the crisp, open spaces of the northern territories. The lush, wild forests he had traveled through were replaced by towns and villages that were less familiar, yet still filled with the shadows of uncertainty. He moved through these spaces like a ghost, always alert, never fully able to let his guard down. The north promised freedom, but it also carried with it its own dangers, and Josiah knew that every step forward was laden with the potential for betrayal. Despite the sense of progress, the journey was far from easy. Each day brought new challenges. Josiah had grown accustomed to hardship, but the constant fear of discovery gnawed at him in ways that even the cruelty of slavery had not. In some ways, the physical torment of the plantation was easier to bear. There, he knew what was expected of him: work, submission, survival. But now, he was walking a tightrope. Each town, each safe house, each person he encountered could be a risk. The uncertainty of whether he would find allies or enemies in the most seemingly innocent places was more unnerving than any lash. He had no choice but to keep moving, to trust his instincts, and to hold on to the promise of freedom that kept his spirit alive. One evening, as Josiah passed through a small town, he found himself in the midst of a situation that would test his resolve. The weather had turned, and a thick fog had descended upon the streets, wrapping the town in an eerie silence. It was a time when he normally would have found shelter and waited until the morning light. But that night, something felt different. He had heard rumors of a group of bounty hunters operating in the area, men whose sole purpose was to track down runaways and return them to the south for a reward. The weight of this knowledge made every shadow appear more ominous. Josiah, still carrying the map given to him by Rebecca, knew that he couldn't risk lingering in the town. The fog, thick and oppressive, had made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead of him, and in such an environment, it was all too easy to be caught off guard. His senses were heightened, every creak of a floorboard, every footstep, every passing figure made his heart race with suspicion. He needed to find shelter before nightfall or risk being exposed. It was then that Josiah saw a figure in the distance, a silhouette against the mist. At first, he froze, unsure whether to approach or retreat. But as the figure drew closer, Josiah's instincts told him to trust. The figure was a woman, her features obscured by the low light, but there was something familiar in the way she moved, quiet, purposeful, like someone who had been down this road before. She stopped in front of him, her voice low and measured. "You're far from home," she said, the words heavy with meaning. Josiah could sense immediately that she was no ordinary passerby. She spoke with a calm confidence, yet there was a wariness in her eyes that betrayed her caution. He knew this woman was someone who had dealt with runaways, someone who understood the risk of harboring them. She didn't introduce herself right away. Instead, she offered him a choice. "I can help you," she said, "but it comes with a price." Josiah, wary but desperate, nodded. He had learned long ago to trust no one, but desperation made him act against that instinct. The woman led him to a small, inconspicuous house at the edge of the town. The home, humble and unassuming, offered little in the way of comfort, but Josiah's exhaustion outweighed his concerns. The woman, whose name he would later learn was Mary, gave him food and a bed for the night, though her hospitality came with clear boundaries. She was an abolitionist, but her work was covert, and she could not afford to be too generous with her help. Over the next few days, Mary provided Josiah with vital information about the route ahead. She told him of the dangers lurking in the north as well, of those who were not abolitionists, of towns where the sympathies of the people were not so clear. Josiah had thought that the further he moved from the south, the safer he would be, but Mary's words reminded him that even in the northern states, his status as a runaway slave would make him a target for those who saw him as property, not as a man. Mary also told Josiah of the network that spanned much of the north, a vast, interconnected web of safe houses, abolitionists, and sympathizers who worked to help runaway slaves make their way to freedom. She spoke of these people with reverence and respect, knowing full well the personal risk they took by defying the laws of the land. The Fugitive Slave Act, passed just a few years earlier, had made it a federal crime to assist runaway slaves, and those caught helping fugitives faced severe punishment. Yet, despite this, many brave individuals, like Mary, continue to risk their lives to defy the law and help enslaved people escape. It was in the quiet moments of conversation with Mary that Josiah began to realize the enormity of what he had been through. He had, in essence, become a part of something much larger than himself. His escape, though deeply personal, was also a part of the broader struggle for freedom. He had become a symbol, in a way, of the fight against the system of slavery that sought to destroy the souls of men like him. This realization added a weight to his journey that was both empowering and burdensome. As much as he longed for personal freedom, Josiah also understood that his journey was now a part of a larger historical movement, a movement that would one day change the very fabric of the nation. But the road to freedom was still fraught with danger. After a few days of rest, Mary sent Josiah on his way, guiding him toward the next safe house. As he left her home, he could feel the weight of the road ahead. Each step felt heavier than the last. The fear that had first accompanied his flight from the plantation was now something deeper, more persistent. He was no longer simply running from the system that had enslaved him, he was also running toward something. But what? Freedom was a distant ideal, not a reality. The journey was long, and it would require more from him than he could ever have anticipated. As Josiah made his way north, he found himself grappling with the question of what freedom truly meant. Was it the absence of chains, the ability to walk where he pleased, to speak freely, to choose his path in life? Or was it something more intangible, a sense of self-possession, the reclamation of a dignity that had been stolen from him? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that freedom was not just a destination, it was a process, a transformation that would take place both within and around him. The journey was not simply about escaping the physical confines of slavery, it was about understanding who he was, what he had become, and what he could yet become. In a sense, he was still in the process of becoming free, and this process would continue long after he crossed into the Northern Territories. The days passed, and Josiah found himself closer to his goal, but the fear never fully left him. Every new person he encountered, every stretch of land he crossed, every shadow in the distance became a reminder that the escape was not yet complete. There were moments when he could almost taste freedom, but they were fleeting, like the fleeting glimpses of daylight through a thick fog. Still, Josiah pressed on, knowing that every step he took was one step closer to something he had once thought impossible. It was not just a physical escape he was making, it was an escape from the very idea that he had ever been less than human. And as he moved forward, he knew that his journey, though difficult and uncertain, was also his declaration of resistance, his refusal to be defined by the system that sought to crush his spirit. As Josiah's journey took him further north, the path he walked became increasingly fraught with challenges that tested not just his body, but also his spirit. The distance from the plantation had given him some physical relief, but the emotional toll of his escape was something that could not be easily shaken. The memories of his life in slavery, the cruelty of the overseers, the constant fear of punishment, and the weight of watching his fellow slaves suffer, they all remained with him. His quest for freedom had become something more than an act of survival, it had become a deep, personal battle to reclaim what had been taken from him, his humanity, his sense of self-worth, and his belief in a future where he could live without the shadow of oppression hanging over him. The further Josiah traveled, the more he came to realize that this was not just a physical journey across the landscape, but an internal struggle against the internalized fear and trauma that had been instilled in him over the years. The fear of capture was always present, lurking in the back of his mind like a dark cloud. But it was not only the fear of being hunted that haunted him, it was the fear of being rejected by those who might help him. He had come to understand that the kindness of strangers was not guaranteed, and he could never fully trust anyone, not even those who seemed sympathetic. In the world he was now navigating, everyone had something to lose. The risk of helping a runaway slave was enormous. Yet, there were still those who chose to defy the law and offer their assistance, even when the cost was high. It was during one of his many nights on the road, camped in a quiet grove near a small town, that Josiah began to truly understand the toll that his journey was taking on him. The isolation was unbearable at times. He longed for human connection, for someone to share in his struggle, someone who understood what it meant to live under the weight of a system that sought to erase his very identity. But in the quiet of the night, as he lay beneath the vast expanse of the sky, he often found himself alone with his thoughts. The questions that had plagued him for so long continued to surface. Was freedom worth the cost? Could he ever truly be free? Would he ever find a place where he could lay down his burdens, where he could rest his soul without fear of being hunted down? The days were long, and the nights even longer. As he traveled through small villages and towns, Josiah relied heavily on the information given to him by those few who had shown him kindness. Every stop was filled with a mixture of hope and dread. Would this be the place where he would find safety? Or would it be the place where his journey came to an abrupt end? His trust in the Underground Railroad network had grown, but he still had to be cautious. He could not afford to make any mistakes. One particular town, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, proved to be a turning point in Josiah's journey. He had arrived there after days of travel through increasingly treacherous terrain, his strength beginning to falter. His body ached from the miles he had walked, and his mind was weary from the constant vigilance required to stay hidden. He had hoped to find shelter in this town, where the network of abolitionists was said to be strong, but he could not shake the feeling that something was not right. The town, though quiet, seemed to be filled with an undercurrent of tension. Josiah had been here for only a few hours when he overheard a conversation between two men in a tavern, the words, bounty hunter, and runaway slave, striking his ears with chilling clarity. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as his instincts screamed at him to leave immediately. He could not afford to stay in that town any longer. The danger was too great. With little time to waste, Josiah gathered his belongings and set off into the night once more, retracing his steps in the darkness, hoping to find refuge elsewhere. The decision to leave was not an easy one. The possibility of capture was real, and the thought of being hunted down once again filled him with a sense of dread. But in the end, it was the knowledge that his freedom was worth more than the temporary comfort of a safe house that pushed him to keep moving forward. Every step he took now was not just for himself, but for the future he hoped to build, a future where he could live as a free man, without fear. After leaving the town, Josiah found himself in a more isolated part of the wilderness, surrounded by dense forests and steep hills. The moonless night made it difficult to navigate, and the eerie silence of the woods seemed to amplify the isolation he felt. But it was in this solitude that Josiah had a rare moment of reflection. He realized that, in many ways, this journey had stripped him of everything he had known, his past, his family, his former self. He was no longer the man who had lived on the plantation, serving his masters without question. He was no longer the obedient slave who had accepted his fate. He was a man reborn, a man who had chosen to fight for his freedom, no matter the cost. But that rebirth had come with a price. The weight of his decisions had become increasingly clear. As he walked through the night, Josiah understood that the world he had once known was gone forever. He could never return to the life he had left behind, not even if he wanted to. The brutal truths of slavery, the horrors he had witnessed, and the depths of human cruelty had forever altered his understanding of the world. And yet, in the midst of this transformation, there was a sense of empowerment. He had chosen to escape, to resist, and to fight for something greater than himself. His journey was not just about his own survival, it was about defying a system that had sought to break him and countless others like him. It was about proving that the human spirit could not be shackled. The next few days brought more hardships. Josiah found himself crossing rough, unfamiliar terrain, often without a clear path. The map he had received from Rebecca had been invaluable, but the roads were far from straightforward. There were times when he had to trust his instincts completely, relying on his knowledge of the land to guide him. The forests were dense and difficult to navigate, and the weather, which had once been a welcome change, now became an additional challenge. Cold rain and heavy winds slowed his progress, and the constant exposure to the elements took a toll on his body. Despite this, Josiah pressed on, driven by the same force that had carried him this far, his desire for freedom. He found moments of solace in the people he met along the way, though they were few and far between. Some offered him food, a place to rest, or simply a kind word. Others were less welcoming, their faces betraying suspicion or fear. Josiah could never be sure whether he was encountering a friend or an enemy, but he had learned to trust his instincts. His survival depended on his ability to read people, to gauge whether they could be trusted with his secret. Even the smallest mistake could lead to betrayal, and he could not afford to make any missteps. He had seen the consequences of failure all too many times, runaways captured and returned to slavery, their bodies broken, their spirits crushed. It was during one of these brief encounters that Josiah learned of a new danger, one that would shape the final leg of his journey. Word had spread of a large group of bounty hunters who were actively hunting runaway slaves in the area, and they were offering a generous reward for anyone who could provide information about their whereabouts. The knowledge of this new threat sent a chill down Josiah's spine. He had already been forced to leave one town to escape capture, and now it seemed that danger was closing in from all sides. He could feel the walls tightening around him, and for the first time in his journey, Josiah began to question whether he could truly make it to freedom. But even in the face of this new threat, Josiah found a sense of resolve that he had not known before. The fear that had once threatened to paralyze him was now a catalyst for action. He could not afford to stop, not now, not when he was so close. He had come too far to turn back. The possibility of failure, of capture, was no longer something he could focus on. Instead, he chose to focus on the future, on the life that lay ahead, the life that he had been denied for so long. Freedom was still out of reach, but Josiah knew that with each step, he was closer to it than ever before.